Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now as we ramp up for Halloween season, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit some of my favorite ways to enhance your haunt, especially if you do a cemetery scene like we do. So here's 10 of my favorite projects to make your cemetery stand out. So in this video, I'm going to be taking it back to basics and build a haunt fence. So let's get to it. This project really started when I saw this finial during a cemetery tour. So I sent this photo to Zach at Big Fred's Customs and asked him to 3D model it for the project. And this is what he sent me. Pretty spot on, I'd say. So with the file in hand, I 3D printed myself a bunch of them and then gave them a quick run through my washing station to remove any excess resin. Then I removed the support materials and ran them in batches through the UV curing process, and then they were ready to be turned into fence posts. Since I'll be going heavy on the texture, I'm not concerned about any marks left behind from support materials, and can get right to gluing them into some 1/2-inch PVC pipe. While I waited for the glue to set, I cut down some 1x2 furring strips into the widths I'd need for this fence, and got to marking the location of all the holes I'll need to drill. I'm using a Forstner bit in my cordless drill, but I'd suggest doing this step in a drill press if you have access to one. I'll be using these 1-inch wood screws to hold the pipes in place, but before I get to that, I'll pre-drill all of my screw holes to prevent the wood from cracking. This is definitely one of those steps that you don't want to skip over, since these furring strips can be a bit temperamental. This may also explain why they're so affordable. With all my holes drilled, it's time to plan out the layout of the crossbars. This is one of those things that I needed to see in relation to the crypt to make sure that the proportions were right. It was at this point that I realized I needed a bit more variety. So imagine you're watching me drill more holes, adding in shorter posts, and finalizing their positions with those 1-inch screws. Because I want this to pack flat for storage, I 3D modeled and printed these corner pieces. They'll be permanently attached to the front section and will be temporarily held in place with a small screw on the side pieces. That way it can be stored flat against a wall where it'll be out of the way. Now that the fence is fully constructed, it's time for paint, starting with a bit of rubberized undercoating spray. Now this not only gives great texture, but it also protects the wood from moisture. Although you'll definitely want to be sure to wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated place should you choose to go this route. Although you definitely can achieve a similar look using textured spray paint. After coating the entire fence, I let it dry for a bit before doing a bit of fast rust paint. I grabbed a spray bottle of water and a rust-colored spray paint and alternated between water and paint to give it a mottled finish. This technique is very similar to how I texture tombstones. The paint won't stick to the water droplets and will get rinsed away when more water is applied, so you end up with a speckled appearance that will absolutely pass the 10-foot test. Now it's not the most dynamic looking rust paint job, but considering how uniform the rust looked on the fences in New Orleans, and the fact that this will mainly be seen in the dark, it's a great quick technique. I have a few other rust paint videos that I'll link in the video description if you're looking for something a bit more realistic. But for now, the only thing left to do was to put it in place in front of the crypt. Now, a few years ago, while visiting cemeteries in New England, I stumbled across these cast iron perpetual care grave markers. Now, they're designed to identify which tombstones and monuments are to be tended to long-term by cemetery staff, and they're just the type of detail that I'd like to add to our haunt. So in this video, I'm going to do just that. So let's get to it. The first thing I'm going to do is take this reference photo I found in an online auction site and import it into Adobe Illustrator so that I can make an outline of the grave marker. Once I'm done with the drawing and text layout, I'll merge all of the layers together and export it as an SVG file, which can then be imported into my 3D modeling software of choice, Fusion 360. With my drawing imported, I'll make a quick selection of the shape and extrude it about a ½ inch. Then I add a chamfer around the edges for a little added detail, as well as a 1/4 inch hole in the bottom that will allow me to insert a small dowel that will act as a ground spike. The last thing I need to do is to save the file, prepare it for print in my 3D Slicer program, and get it onto my printer. Then I could sit back and watch the printer do its thing. And just like that, the print is finished and ready for a bit of sanding and then some paint. But before I get into paint, I'm going to start by adding a bit of texture. For this piece, I'm going to take a slightly different approach than usual by mixing up a bit of baby powder with some superglue. This will create a thin paste that I can use to stipple some texture onto the surface of the 3D print, and if all goes well, should look like an old metal casting. As an added bonus, the superglue adds some additional rigidity to the print and should help to keep its shape during the hot summer months when it's in storage. After a quick application and a few minutes of dry time, I can finally get to painting. I'm going to start with a dark gray matte chalk paint and apply it to the entire piece using the same stippling motion I used for the superglue and baby powder paste. This will add even more texture, and with the addition of a brighter metallic paint, should help to catch the light a bit more. Chalk paints tend to dry pretty quickly, so after a few minutes I could move on to the silver metallic acrylic paint layer. I'm aiming for a patchy application that allows both the dark and light colored paints to be visible, sort of like what galvanized metal looks like. Once the silver paint is dry, I'll give it a quick black wash with some thinned out acrylic paint, being sure to keep my spray bottle of water handy in case the black paint goes on too heavy. Now the only thing left to do is put it in the display. Now, as a haunter from Southern California, the idea of moss or lichen seems completely foreign. But as a haunter who spent a fair amount of time in East Coast cemeteries, it's an absolute necessity for any tombstone or monument. So in this video, I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to add dimensional lichen to your props. So let's get to it. As someone who's always looking for easy ways to give my tombstones a more realistic or organic look, the idea of adding lichen has been at the top of my list, but I've never really thought about how I'd accomplish it. Now I could just use paint, but that didn't seem quite right. It needed to have texture and volume, and after considering a variety of methods to create the texture in lichen, I landed on what's becoming somewhat of a frequent medium on this channel, acrylic modeling paste. What's great about acrylic modeling paste is that it can be tinted with acrylic paints and will give them more body, which is exactly what I'm looking for to recreate the texture of lichen. I started by adding about a tablespoon of the modeling paste to a small container, and then a small amount of the lighter of my two yellow acrylic paints, and mixed them together until the color was consistent. Then I could get to application. There's a bunch of different types of lichen, but the one I'll be recreating, and the kind I think of whenever someone mentions it, is called crustose lichen. It has a tight, almost mossy look to it. So I'll apply the modeling paste and paint mixture using a stippling motion to try and recreate this texture. It's a pretty warm day when I'm working on this, so the acrylic paste is drying quickly, which will allow me to bulk up the areas I've already painted to give it even more dimension. While I'm painting, I'm trying to make it as random as possible, using reference photos to help guide the shapes and clusters. It's really helpful and is a deterrent from creating patterns in the application, which is something we all do whether we realize it or not. For the areas that are a bit thicker, I'll use my heat gun to help speed up the drying process before moving on to the next step. Now that everything is dried, or at least dried enough to move on, I'll add a bit of raw umber to my light yellow and modeling paste mix. This will be the darker undertone of my lichen. Once the paint is thoroughly mixed, I'll start applying it just as I did the lighter color, but I'll only be applying it to the centers of the lichen patches. Since lichen tends to be thicker towards the middle, its coloring is slightly darker than the edges, so this darker yellow color will help to give these patches a bit more depth once I apply the final color. The final color in this process is a slightly warmer yellow that, when applied lightly over the top of the other two colors, helps to tie it all together. So with a small amount of paint on my brush, I'll stipple it onto the clusters to help blend the previous two colors while still allowing them to show through. This can take a little practice, so start light and build up to your final color. And once I felt like I had a good feel for the technique, I added lichen to the rest of the tombstone, and then this one was done. So this week, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different from usual. Now, of course, I'll have my tips and techniques, but the thing I'll be making for this video might be going home with you. So let's get into it. Before I can get started, I'll need a sign for this technique, and I thought that this one I laser cut from MDF would be a good candidate. It's already been sealed with clear coat to prevent the MDF from absorbing the paint, so I can jump right into adding some texture. And for that I'll be using one of my favorite methods, spray adhesive. The brand and version of spray adhesive isn't as important as how it sprays. This one leaves a nice fine texture when applied and will be perfect for this sign. Once I've built up a few layers, I'll add even more irregularity with some baby powder. I'll do this step in multiple layers, applying more spray adhesive as needed until the deepest part of the sign has sort of a pitted texture. Then I'll remove any excess powder from the sign and set it aside to dry. After a few minutes, I can get to my base layers of paint, starting with a caramel color and a dark brown. The caramel color can be applied to the entire sign, making sure to get into all the recesses, and once I've got good coverage, I can switch over to the dark brown. For this layer, I'm aiming for a mottled appearance, so I try to dust the surface, moving in irregular patterns until I get a good mix of the two colors without it looking too intentional. When I'm happy with its appearance, I'll allow it to dry for a bit before moving on to the next step. With the base paint applied, you can see the texture a bit better. I definitely could have gone heavier with the powder layer in some places, but overall I like the direction this is going. Now comes the fun part, highlighting the raised elements of the sign, and for this I'll be using some antique gold acrylic paint. I'll start by applying this with a dry brush to help build depth in the finish, and then we'll go back with more paint to make some areas brighter than others. This should help to give it an old and worn look. You could use rub and buff for this as well. I just prefer paint because I find it easier to use a brush for the smaller letters. Plus, paint can be much more forgiving if you end up getting it in places you didn't intend to. When all the letters and outer band are painted, I'll remove as much of the paint from my brush, and then we'll dry brush the entire surface with whatever's left to give it just a slight hint of gold. This isn't something you'll necessarily see, but it helps to tell the story of this old cemetery sign. With that out of the way, we can get into aging the sign with color washes. I've mixed up a small amount of white acrylic paint and water, somewhere in the range of 1 part paint to 10 parts water, and we'll use it to create a calcified water stain look. This will be applied in a few layers, with dry time in between to give it depth, and I'll keep a damp towel to blot away any areas where the wash may be pooling or just generally not looking how I want it to. This kind of staining is really common on grave markers, and I thought this was a good opportunity to use this look for aging this sign. Another great thing about this method is that it dries fairly quick, so you can get a real sense of how it looks and whether or not you'll need to apply more to achieve the look you're after without having to wait a long time for the paint to dry. Now that the sign is completely dry, you can see just how layered the staining is, and how much it helps to accentuate the textures we created at the beginning. And while most people will likely be seeing this at night, it's these types of details that really sell the piece. The next step in this project is to add a bit of patina with some heavily watered down teal acrylic paint. This is a similar approach to the water staining, but rather than spraying it on, I'll be using a small brush to add just a few random hints of color to the sign. I'm using the water staining layer to help guide my placement, since it would make sense organically that the areas with more staining would likely be the first to discolor. So I identified a few of the big concentrations of white wash and dabbed some of the teal paint in those areas to make it just a bit more interesting. In the event that I added too much paint, I could dry out my brush on a paper towel and use it to wick up the excess. That way I'm not left with any areas where the patina is unrealistic or distracting. I decided to show a little restraint with this layer but you can add as much or as little as you think works for your prop and the environment it'll be seen in. As a final touch, once everything had dried, I went back in with a lighter gold color and highlighted just a few random letters on the sign. This will give it just a little pop since the washes have dulled down the other paints and will add to the overall depth we've created with each layer. And with that, the sign is done and ready to be shipped off to its new owner. I recently put out a tutorial that showed you how to make anything look like metal using graphite powder and shellac. And while this is a great effect, it can be a bit expensive, especially if you're doing a large project. So after receiving a few messages about this, I put my thinking cap on to come up with a method that's a bit more cost-effective and uses some stuff that you'd find around the house. So let's get to it. As with most projects, I needed a part to demonstrate the effect, so I'm using this 3D printed antique lock that I 3D modeled and printed. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to download one for yourself. The next thing I'll need is some black acrylic paint. You can use any style of paint, just make sure it has a matte finish. The last thing we need is baking soda. This is going to thicken the paint and will allow me to give it some texture during the painting process that will make it resemble cast iron. To make the lock easier to paint, I put some double-sided tape on a popsicle stick to give it a bit of a handle. This isn't necessary for the effect, it's just a favorite method of mine for handling small parts. With that taken care of, it's time to mix our paint and baking soda. I found that it's roughly a 1-to-1 mix, but you can add more if you find that it's difficult to brush on. Once it's got a good consistency, I'll grab an acid brush and get to painting. I like using acid brushes because the bristles are really stiff and they're good for creating texture. I'll start by covering the entire piece and then use a pouncing or stippling motion to create peaks and valleys in the paint. This will help to give it that old rusted out appearance. If your piece has any fine details like mine does, you'll want to make sure not to go too heavy in those areas so that they'll still be visible to highlight later. It's okay to be messy with this process, and don't be afraid to add too much. You can use it to work around the entire piece and help build up to your final texture. This is a great technique that could be used for creating old metal strap door hardware for a dungeon, prop weapons like swords or handcuffs, and just about anything that you want to look like it's been left to erode out in the elements. As you can see, it holds its shape really well. Plus, the baking soda gives the paint a grittier, sandy texture. If you really want to build up the finish, apply your first coat of the paint and baking soda mixture and then set it aside to dry. Once it's completely dry, apply a second coat. When I'm happy with how it looks, I set it aside to dry and went to grab some paints to help sell the rusty appearance. I'm going with two favorites, burnt sienna and hot saffron. In addition to those paints, I'll be thinning them with a bit of matte medium or glaze. This helps to give them a bit of translucency and extends the working time of the paint so that I can apply it and wipe it off as needed to achieve just the right rust effect. I started with the burnt sienna and then switched to the hot saffron as a highlight, being sure to work the paint into the details and wiping off any excess that looks a bit too heavy-handed. This approach allows you to build up to your final effect, so don't worry about nailing it on the first pass. Plus, the amount of glaze used determines just how strong your rust highlights will appear, so you'll want to test out your mix to get a feel for it. You may have noticed that I've been mixing the burnt sienna and hot saffron paint. This is to help create subtle variations in the rust color to prevent it from looking too high contrast. It's also a great way to create depth in your paint finish. Something to consider when you're painting is how the piece will be seen. If it'll be in dim lighting, you may want to make the paint a bit more dramatic so that it can still be seen in the dark. If it'll be under brighter lighting, you may want to go with a more realistic approach. A few last touches of our rust highlights, plus a bit of clear coat off camera, and I think it's safe to call this one done. Today we're going to be making a distressed sign for our cemetery fence based on one we saw at Highgate Cemetery in London on a recent trip. For this sign, I'm using a 1/4-inch piece of MDF for the base. I coated it in Mod Podge and allowed it to dry. Once the Mod Podge is dry, take white spray paint and coat the entire piece. Then, take an ivory spray paint and add patches of color to give the appearance of slight discoloration. You can take a heat gun or hairdryer to your parts to help speed up the drying process. But if using a heat gun, be sure to keep it at a safe distance so you don't blister your paint. Next up is an old favorite, kosher salt. Randomly sprinkle salt around the edges of the sign base. These are areas that will be masked from the paint in the next step. Once you're happy with the placement, coat your sign in rust-colored paint. This coat doesn't have to be solid, since we're trying to create variation across the piece. Next, take a light yellow, I'm using Rust-Oleum Summer Squash, and again create small patches of color. If you've gone too heavy, alternate back to the rust color until the desired look is achieved. Now that everything's dry, it's time to remove the salt. Grab a brush and remove as much of the salt as possible to expose the base paint. To create more depth, I'm going to apply a second layer of salt and another dusting of spray paint. This process is very forgiving, and you can add as few or as many passes with salt and paint until you reach the right look. Apply a quick layer of clear coat to seal in your color. Next up, I'm going to apply a stencil that I created with my vinyl cutter. Once the stencil is set, I'm going to take some matte black spray paint to fill in the design. This coat doesn't have to be very opaque, since we're trying to create the look of natural aging, which typically includes fading. Now you can remove the stencil to expose your lettering. I had a bit of overspray, but we'll be able to fix that with one last bit of salt and some additional dusting of the rust and yellow spray paints. As an added touch of realism, find some old screws and add them to the corners of your sign. This will also give us a place to add some rust streaks. To add those rust streaks, you'll need some burnt orange acrylic paint, a small amount of water, a spray bottle of water, and a small paintbrush. We're going to wet down the surface of our sign to help break the surface tension and create a path for our orange paint to drip down. You'll still want to thin your paint in a cup of water so that it will run down the sign to create rust streaks. Add streaks both above and below the screw heads, being sure to get some of the paint into the crevices of the screw head. Once you've got it looking the way you want, allow it to dry and give it a final spray with clear coat. Tombstone carvings are a great way to add some much needed character to an otherwise flat canvas. But finding store-bought appliques to fit your need are hard to come by. In this video, I'm going to show you how I took a piece of foam and turned it into a bit of cemetery symbolism. To get started, I took a 1/2-inch piece of foam and used some double-sided carpet tape to help keep it in place on my Lazy Susan. This is the best way to keep your materials secure while still giving you the flexibility to rotate it as needed. I found a photo online of the pointing finger image that I liked, scaled it up to the size I needed for my tombstone, and printed it out. Then I'll hold it in place with a few pins and trace the details into the foam. Once I've transferred all the details, I'll go over those lines with a Sharpie to make them easier to follow. This will be my guide for all the major details that I'll follow as I begin to sand and shave down the foam into the finished piece. It's important to keep your reference image nearby to help with any of the details that you didn't trace onto the foam, like shading or textures. It's also great to have some kind of physical reference, in this case my own hand, to help inform any decisions about how deep to sculpt a particular feature or to answer questions that can't be determined from your reference photo. I'll start roughing out the shapes with a Dremel tool. This bit has a soft taper to it, so I figured it would help make the transitions look a bit more natural, but you could use a variety of Dremel bits for this passive carving. Once I had the larger details carved out, I decided to switch to a sanding stick to shave down the edges and add in the shallow recesses around the knuckles and in the palm. This is the most time-consuming part of making your own applique, especially if you're like me and you're not used to working at a smaller scale. But using the sanding sticks keeps you from removing too much material at once so that you can build in a bit of a safety net. To create some deeper recesses without removing too much material, I grabbed an X-Acto knife to cut the lines between fingers and pick out some bits of foam in the areas that were going to be more dimensional. You could use a utility knife or even a razor blade for this step. As the shape starts getting more defined, you'll notice that I switch back and forth between all of the different tools to help refine each area, checking my reference image and my own hand to make sure I'm capturing all the details. When I'm happy with the overall shape, I'll sand down the back with my belt sander to roughly a ½ inch of foam, and then I'll do some more by hand to make sure it lays completely flat. Because this piece was going to be painted with Drylock, I knew that I didn't have to get too detailed with the sculpting. So when I felt like I had captured the important details, it was time to coat it with Drylock and call it done. As you can see, a lot of the uneven texture in my carving has been hidden by paint, and all of the major anatomical landmarks are deep enough that you can make out that it's a hand with a pointing finger. The only thing to do now is apply the carving to my tombstone with Gorilla Glue, and after some paint and weathering, the tombstone was done.
Now, as someone who loves the look of old cemeteries full of fall-colored leaves, but lives in a nearly treeless neighborhood, I wanted to come up with a way to recreate the look that didn't involve me spending an afternoon raking leaves at a local park. But more importantly, I needed something that wouldn't blow away in the wind and could be reused year after year. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I solved my problem by creating fake leaf mats. So let's get into it.
To get started, I'll need a few supplies, including some artificial fall-colored leaves, some dark green tulle with as open a mesh as you can find, and a pair of scissors. I picked up 5 yards of this hunter green tulle for $1 a yard, which will leave me with enough material to make about 10 mats. But before I can do anything, I'll need to cut it down into a 36 by 36 inch square. This mesh is 72 inches wide, so I cut the length and then could unfold the material and cut down the fold line to give me 2 equal pieces. Now that I've got my first mat, I'm going to fold it in half and then fold it in half again, and we'll cut the outside edge into a quarter round shape so that when I unfold it, I'll have a 36 inch round for my base. And don't worry about getting it perfectly round. You'll never see it under haunt lighting. With my mesh cut into shape, I can get to applying my fake maple leaves to it using a bit of spray adhesive. This is a bit time-consuming and is not a permanent solution, but it will allow me the ability to place the leaves temporarily so that I can make any adjustments if needed. I started by spraying each leaf, but eventually switched to laying out handfuls with the underside facing up and applying the adhesive in batches before sticking them to the mesh. This is both a sticky and stinky process, so be sure to wear appropriate safety equipment. While I'm laying out the leaves, I'm doing my best not to create any patterns. In fact, I started to kind of throw the leaves onto the mesh to make it a bit more random, and then I could press them down into position. You'll also want to avoid adding too many leaves along the round edge of the mesh to prevent that edge from standing out once you have it in your haunt. Once I've applied all my leaves and I'm happy with their placement, I take it out to the yard for a test fit. I tried to flatten it to the best of my ability, and then I could place my tombstone on top of it, take a step back, and then see how it looks. I'm happy to say that even in the daytime, the mesh does a pretty decent job of blending into what little grass we have, but there's definitely too many leaves around the edges. Thankfully, the spray adhesive isn't strong enough in this application to permanently hold the leaves in place, and so off camera I removed anything that didn't look right. I also took the time to remove any leaves that you wouldn't be able to see from the front, which also helps to stretch my leaf budget a bit further. Now, with the mesh flipped over, I can get to permanently bonding the leaves to the mesh, and for that I'll be using some felt. I just need to cut it into 1-inch squares. That's better. These pieces of felt, along with the help of some hot glue, will help to keep the leaves in place without making them look overly flat. So with the glue gun at the ready, I got to adding the felt to the back of each leaf. I'm shooting to add glue in the widest part of each leaf so that you won't see any of the felt peeking out, but also so that the outer edge of the leaves can still move a bit, which should help them to look a bit more realistic. With all the leaves glued down, I was able to flip over the mesh and take a look at everything. In hindsight, I should have gone with clear glue and a lighter colored felt, since the combination can be seen from the opposite side of the leaves. But I think it's alright for now. Plus I want to tone down the brightness of these leaves, which should help to make it less visible. To do that, I grabbed a can of dark brown spray paint and gave everything a dusting to bring these leaves closer to a more natural weathered look. Then I followed it up with a warm caramel color to give it a bit more variety. Once my paint was dry, I could grab my leaf mat, set it in place, and see how it looks. I'm happy to say that even in the midday sun, the mesh blends right in with the small amount of grass that we have, and I imagine that in the dark you won't be able to see it at all. It's not until you're within a few inches that you can actually make out that the leaves are attached to the mesh, which is a lot better than I expected when I had this idea. I also think to really sell the effect, a good non-destructive way would be to add some leaves to the tombstone with some push pins. It'll keep them from blowing away and also allows you the ability to change them up in the future.
So one of the things I love about our haunt is the addition of small elements that you may find in a real cemetery. It's a great way to introduce some texture and realism, and occasionally light, like these votive candle holders I saw at a recent cemetery trip in New England. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make some for your own haunt, plus to keep it interesting, I'm going to do a high budget and low budget version. So let's get into it.
Starting with the high budget version, I've 3D modeled and printed some parts including the base, cap, and insert pieces. I'll also need a 33.8 ounce water bottle with the labels removed, 3 7/32 by 12 inch brass tubes, and lastly, a 3 by 4 inch battery powered LED pillar candle. If you were doing multiples or wanted to wire it into a 12 volt system, this could be swapped for DIY LED candles. With that out of the way, let's get to measuring and trimming down these brass tubes into 7-inch segments. Once I've got everything marked, I'll use a small pipe cutter to trim them into their final sizes. I decided to go with brass because the color would be a good match, but brass is a soft metal and requires a bit more care when cutting it to prevent crimping, hence the pipe cutter. This pipe cutter works by using a small sharpened disc that presses against the pipe and scores it as you rotate the pipe or the cutter. This step gets repeated, turning the dial to move the disc closer to the pipe until you've cut all the way through. Then I just have to repeat this for the third piece and can move on to the next part of the build. I'll do a quick test fit to make sure everything fits together, and then I can move on to the second version of this prop. For the low-budget version, I'll be using a few plastic bowls I picked up at the dollar store and 3/4-inch dowels cut to 7-inch segments. I'll start by marking off 3 points inside of the bowl to act as a guide for placement of the dowels. And to make sure they're in the same place for both bowls, I'll place my second bowl inside the first to copy my markings. The next thing I'll need are some small pieces of cardboard which will act as supports for my dowels. These will get glued into the bowls, and once they're set, I'll take my first bowl and one of the dowels and we'll start gluing the dowels into position. In hindsight, this wasn't the best approach to this glue up, since holding them in place while the glue cooled wasn't the best use of my time, but also because I realized later in the build that I needed to add a couple of foam rings to help tidy everything up, and they could have helped to hold the dowels in position better than I did. Oh well, live and learn. When the dowels felt secure, I went back and added more glue to shore them up a bit more, and then I could do a quick test fit. The top bowl will be left loose because I want to have access to the candle inside. So now that it's all assembled, I can give everything a coat of primer and set it aside to dry and move on to prepping the bottles. I found this 33.8 ounce water bottle that was similar in diameter to an actual votive candle, but needed the base and neck removed. So I grabbed my razor blade and carefully started cutting. I wasn't looking for an exact cut, since I found it was easier to do that with a pair of scissors. And once the unnecessary sections were removed, I could do the final trimming and set them aside for later. With the primer fully dry, I could coat the parts with a black spray paint. And when the black spray paint was dry, I switched to a bright metallic gold spray paint. Metallics can sometimes be temperamental, so you'll want to apply a light coat first, and once it's started to dry, follow up with your second pass. This should help to prevent any runs in your paint. Once they were painted, I let them dry for the night and picked back up on the build the next morning. Earlier I mentioned adding in foam rings, so now that the paint is dry, I can get them installed. These were cut slightly larger than the diameter of the bowls, and the inner diameter hole is roughly the size of the water bottle. I added in 3 notches so that it would wrap around the dowels as well as hide the messy glue application on the inside. These were glued in place with CA glue and painted in the same gold metallic spray paint. I also used one of the water bottle caps and a dowel from Mrs. Van Oak's garden to make a stake for the candle holder, which will get glued to the bottom with some CA glue. And once the glue was set, I could add in the candle and plastic bottle and take a look at how it turned out. I'll also do a quick assembly of the high-budget version, placing the brass rods into the 2 rings, and then setting it into the base, dropping in the candle and plastic bottle, and adding the cap. I used the other half of the dowel from Mrs. Van Oak's garden to create a stake for this candle holder, and that will get installed into the hole in the base. Now you could leave them like this, but I want to use this as another opportunity to add some color into our display. So I picked up some colored lighting gels and cut them to fit the plastic bottle pieces and taped them along the seams so that it would be hidden under the base and cap pieces. And then I can call this one done. Now I just have to wait for sundown. While the red version looks great, something I hadn't considered when picking gel colors was just how saturated the blue color is and how it limits light transmission. But I think I may revisit the high-budget version in the future to add my own candles with brighter LEDs and hopefully make this votive candle holder stand out a bit more.
People ask, how do you make good cobwebs? Well, I'll tell you, they come in a can. The one and only thing you'll need to accomplish some quick, realistic cobwebs is a can of Loctite 300 heavy spray adhesive. For this video, I'm using a makeshift candelabra since it'll be a good way to demonstrate how the webbing looks when it drapes between objects. I'll have more on the candelabra project in a future video. Loctite 300 is a contact adhesive that, when applied with a slight upward trajectory and using a circular motion, can create the look of cobwebs. It's great in a pinch, especially if you don't have a web gun or a compressor,
I like to apply it in a few passes and at varying distances to get more variety in the density and thickness of the webbing. It takes a bit of practice, but once you get the hang of it, it's a great addition to any haunter's tool bag.
Now hopefully this build helped to give you some ideas for unique additions to your haunt, whether they be high budget, low budget, or somewhere in between. It just goes to show that with a little creativity, you can recreate just about anything. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.